Venture capital sounds modern, but the basic idea is much older than Silicon Valley. Long before startup founders pitched investors in glass offices, one family in Renaissance Florence was already doing something very similar. They backed ambitious people early. They spread money through networks. They invested in talent, influence, prestige, and politics. And when those bets paid off, they didn't just make profits. They helped shape an entire civilization. This is the story of the Medici, the family that invented venture capital 600 years ago. Now, to be clear, the Medici did not call themselves venture capitalists. They were bankers, merchants, political operators, and patrons. They did not fund software companies or biotech labs. They funded artists, popes, rulers, architects, scholars, and institutions. But if you strip venture capital down to its core idea, the resemblance is hard to miss. Find promising people before everyone else believes in them. Back them with money and connections. Accept risk. Shape the environment around the investment. And if the investment succeeds, don't just take a profit. Take influence. That was the Medici formula, and it worked so well that their family name became permanently tied to the Renaissance itself. To understand why, we need to start in Florence. Florence, in the 14th and 15th centuries, was one of the most dynamic cities in Europe. It was wealthy, competitive, and politically unstable. This was not a sleepy medieval town. It was a place full of traders, bankers, workshops, guilds, rival families, and constant maneuvering for advantage. Cloth and banking helped fuel the city's economy. Money moved through ledgers and contracts. Reputation mattered, credit mattered, connections mattered. In a place like that, talent could rise quickly, but it could also collapse just as fast. Florence rewarded ambition, but it punished weakness. That was the environment in which the Medici rose. They were not ancient kings. They were not born into unquestioned royal power. Their climb began in business, especially banking. And that matters, because banking teaches two lessons very quickly. First, money is not just money. It is trust. Second, if you lend to the right people early enough, you don't just earn interest. You gain leverage over their future. The Medici understood both. They built one of the most important banking networks in Europe. Their bank expanded into major commercial centers. They handled money for merchants, elites, rulers, and church officials. That alone made them powerful. But what made them extraordinary was not simply that they had money. It was how they used it. They did not just sit on wealth. They placed strategic bets. And that is where the venture capital comparison really comes alive. Modern venture capital is not just about handing cash to a company and hoping for the best. It is about identifying people and systems that might become far more valuable in the future, getting involved early, and then helping shape the conditions for success. The Medici did exactly that, just in Renaissance form. They invested in political careers. They invested in church relationships. They invested in art and architecture. They invested in scholars and public prestige. They invested in the idea that influence itself could be cultivated, expanded, and compounded. That is much bigger than ordinary banking. The key early figure here is Cosimo de' Medici. If the Medici story were a startup story, Cosimo would be the founder who sees the game more clearly than everyone else. He was not a flashy conqueror. He was not a man trying to dominate Florence through brute force. He was smarter than that. Cosimo understood that Florence was technically a republic, but in practice, power flowed through relationships, alliances, debts, and patronage. If you wanted to control a city like Florence, you did not necessarily need a crown. You needed to become the person that everyone important depended on. So Cosimo built dependency. He lent money. He supported allies. He rescued people in financial trouble. He cultivated goodwill with institutions. He made himself useful to powerful families, public figures, and religious authorities. That is one of the deepest rules of venture capital and network power. If enough people's future depends on your support, they start protecting your position for you. Cosimo was not just funding transactions. He was funding a web of obligations. And once that web became large enough, the Medici were no longer just another wealthy family. They became the family around which much of Florence revolved. But finance alone was not enough. This is what separates the Medici from countless rich merchant families who were eventually forgotten. They invested in prestige. They understood that money becomes more powerful when it changes the world visibly. So they funded churches, libraries, scholars, and public works. They supported art and architecture. They helped make Florence more impressive, more beautiful, and more intellectually alive. At one level, this was generosity. At another, it was one of the smartest branding strategies in history. Because when you fund visible excellence, people stop seeing you as merely rich. They begin seeing you as necessary. If a building transforms the skyline and your family paid for it, your family becomes part of the city's identity. If a scholar flourishes under your patronage, your family begins to look like a guardian of intelligence. If artists thrive because you believed in them early, your money starts looking like vision instead of mere wealth. That is exactly how modern venture investors like to think about themselves. Not just as people who make money, but as people who help create the future. The Medici were doing that centuries earlier, and they were doing it in one of the most creative places on earth. Renaissance Florence was full of astonishing talent, but talent without support often goes nowhere. A brilliant sculptor still needs commissions. A painter still needs materials, workshops, and buyers. An architect still needs someone willing to fund a project before the result exists. That is a high-risk, high-reward environment. And high-risk, high-reward environments are exactly where venture-style thinking matters most. The Medici did not back guaranteed outcomes. They backed potential. Sometimes that potential was artistic. Sometimes it was political. Sometimes it was religious. Sometimes it was urban and civic. But the underlying logic stayed the same. Invest early in people and institutions that could become much more valuable later. And if they succeed, make sure your family becomes inseparable from that success. That is why their support of artists and thinkers mattered so much. It was not just decorative, it was strategic. They were not only buying paintings or funding buildings, they were investing in Florence as a platform. The more dazzling Florence became, the more the Medici looked like the family that made it possible. That creates an extraordinary kind of return. Not just money, legitimacy. That is one of the most powerful concepts in this story, because wealth on its own can be fragile. People envy it, rivals attack it, governments confiscate it. But if you convert wealth into legitimacy, the fortune becomes harder to dislodge. That is what the Medici were always trying to do. They took financial capital and turned it into cultural capital. Then they turned cultural capital into political resilience. That is a far more advanced move than simply getting rich. And if one Medici best represents this fusion of money, culture, and influence, it is Lorenzo de' Medici, better known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. By Lorenzo's time, the family had already built an extraordinary platform. They were no longer just successful bankers. They were the unofficial center of Florentine power. Lorenzo took that inheritance and amplified it. He became famous as a patron of art, literature, and scholarship. Under his influence, Florence became even more closely associated with the flowering of Renaissance culture. It is easy to romanticize Lorenzo's world. Elegant palaces, brilliant artists, humanist scholars, poetry, beauty, and conversation. But underneath that elegance was power. Patronage was not separate from politics. Patronage was politics. To support an artist was to shape public culture. To support a scholar was to shape prestige. To fund beauty was to make your own family look like the engine of civilization. The Medici understood that if you want durable influence, you should not only fund profitable things, you should fund meaningful things. That is what modern investors do when they try to attach their name to moonshot technologies, elite universities, breakthrough science, or cultural institutions. They are not just buying returns. They are buying narrative, identity, and symbolic power. The Medici were masters of narrative. They made their family look like the patron of talent, the sponsor of brilliance, the house that backed excellence before it was fully recognized. That is one reason the venture capital comparison fits so well. Great investors are not merely picking winners. They are participating in the making of winners. And the Medici did that again and again. They also understood diversification. This is another strikingly modern feature of their strategy. They did not place one all-or-nothing bet and hope it paid off. They spread influence across multiple domains at the same time. Banking, trade, political alliances, religious connections, marriage, culture, urban development, public image. Some loans failed. Some allies disappointed them. Some ventures weakened. Some branches of the family bank struggled. But the network as a whole was broad enough that the family kept recovering, adapting, and expanding its influence. That is classic portfolio logic. Build enough overlapping bets that one failure does not destroy the entire system. The Medici also operated in a dangerous environment, which makes their success even more impressive. Renaissance Italy was fragmented, competitive, and volatile. City-states fought each other. Families plotted. Exile and confiscation were real threats. Foreign powers intervened. The church was deeply entangled in politics. This was not a stable environment for long-term planning. And yet the Medici kept finding ways to stay central. They used information, they used credit, they used access, they used timing. They stayed close to whatever person or institution might shape the next outcome. That is another venture capital habit, staying near the future, even when the future is unstable. But the most astonishing sign of their success may be this. The Medici did not just finance power. Eventually, they became power. Over time, members of the family rose to the highest levels of the church. The Medici produced popes. Think about how extraordinary that is. A banking family from Florence became so deeply embedded in the networks of Europe that its influence reached the top of Western Christendom. That is not a normal return on investment. That is money becoming civilizational authority. This is where the Medici stop looking like a wealthy family and start looking like a platform for influence itself. If you wanted access, status, advancement, or protection, their network kept appearing. They were not just funding the system, they were becoming the system through which ambitious people had to pass. That is exactly what the most powerful investors always want. Not merely to succeed within an ecosystem, but to become indispensable to it. And yet, like all great financial dynasties, the Medici also reveal the limits of their own model. Because venture-style thinking is powerful, but it is risky. The Medici Bank faced bad debts, political entanglements, and management problems. Lending to powerful people can be profitable, but powerful people are dangerous clients. They have prestige, but they do not always repay. A ruler may depend on you and still default. A prestigious alliance can be good for status and terrible for the balance sheet. That is a lesson many financial houses have learned the hard way. The Medici were brilliant at turning wealth into influence. But influence can tempt a family into decisions that are good for reputation and bad for business discipline. And over time, that happened. Their financial machinery weakened in certain areas, even as their cultural and political prestige remained immense. In a way, they became victims of their own success. The hungry banking family became an entrenched elite dynasty. The builders became the establishment. And that is another surprisingly modern lesson. Sometimes the disruptors who understand risk best eventually become so powerful that they stop behaving like nimble builders and start behaving like gatekeepers. The outsider becomes the institution. The investor becomes the dynasty. The future maker becomes the old order. That happened to the Medici. They began as ambitious financiers in a fiercely competitive republic. They ended as one of the defining families of Renaissance Europe. And through that rise, they left behind a model that still feels familiar. Back talent early. Fund uncertain but high-potential people and projects. Use money to create networks, not just profits. Attach your name to visible excellence. Convert financial success into legitimacy. Then convert legitimacy into lasting power. That is an extraordinary formula. It is also why the title of this episode is more than just a catchy line. The Medici did not literally invent venture capital, but they understood its deepest logic centuries before modern finance gave it a name. They knew that the most powerful investments are often made before the wider world recognizes their value. They knew that backing talent can be more important than backing finished products. They knew that culture, prestige, and political access can generate returns just as significant as direct profit. And they knew that if you do this well enough, you do not just accumulate money. You shape the future. That is exactly what they did. They helped turn Florence into one of the most dazzling cities in history. They backed people and projects that became central to the Renaissance. They transformed a family bank into a dynasty. And they proved that the smartest investors are often not the ones chasing immediate gain, but the ones patient enough to support talent, institutions, and ideas before the payoff is obvious. So, when we call the Medici the family that invented venture capital 600 years ago, what we really mean is this. They saw that money could do more than buy comfort or status. Money could identify possibility. Money could accelerate talent. Money could make itself indispensable to the future. And in Renaissance Florence, no family understood that better than the Medici.